Hey, everybody. This is Adam Gold.
Hey, and I'm Rishi.
And welcome to Organizing Upgrades. This is not a drill live. This is our show where we draw lessons for left organizers about electoral strategy in 2020 and beyond.
Well, Adam, as usual, it's sort of our standard thing at this point. So much has changed between this episode and the last one. It's hard to keep track of all the unfolding events. But, again, coronavirus is exploding in a bunch of places around the country. Folks still struggling to sort of come to terms in some places with this unfolding pandemic. But in the meantime, the election gets closer and closer. Some people, sort of poll watchers, are getting quite confident about a Trump defeat way too prematurely. But at the same time, Trump is just ratcheting up his attacks on protests in the street, on oppressed communities generally. Immigrant communities in particular, are under direct attack. ICE is just in a very emboldened moment, snatching people from the streets, from protests, almost sort of launching civilian militias through these ICE citizen academies that they've been training here in Chicago. Trump setting federal agents into Portland, again here in Chicago, and now many other cities, as a sort of preview of a way that he's going to try to win the narrative and potentially sort of cynically steal the election. So these are some of the things that we want to talk to our guests about tonight, right? For folks who are sort of in the crosshairs of the white nationalists, of the far right, and from the white nationalists in chief, from the Trump administration. We really want to understand how people are responding, what strategies people are implementing to get us out of the place that we're in and really guide us to victory. Let's get into that.
So we have a great panel today with some folks, as Rishi said, really at the intersection of multiple oppressions, multiple movements and struggles under our system. They're leading organizations and efforts to build powerful organized bases and electoral machines in states across the country and nationally. Our guests are M. Adams, Co-Executive Director of Freedom, Inc., Daroneshia Duncan-Boyd, Executive Director of the Trans United Fund, and Judith LeBlanc, Director of Native Organizers Alliance.
So before we dive in, and I'm eager to get started, we do want to encourage everyone who's watching on Facebook and YouTube to throw your thoughts and comments into the chat. Also, please give Organizing Upgrade a like on Facebook. Our journal is really one of the few places where left organizers can seriously debate strategy, not just sort of journalistically report their efforts or recite left polemics. One of the ways that we're able to sustain this work, besides through the sort of Herculean effort of our volunteer editorial team, is with donations and support. We want to ask folks to help sustain Organizing Upgrade with a donation, or better still, a recurring contribution. Someone's going to be posting links to that in the chat, and we thank you in advance for that. And we want to say thanks, as always, to our partner, the Real News Network, for holding down the tech and the video production, a big effort behind the scenes. And we want to thank our co-hosts for this episode, which we have a bunch of this time: Freedom, Inc., Native Organizers Alliance, Trans United Fund, Groundswell Action Fund, and Progressive Democrats of America. Someone will be occasionally sharing the Twitter handles of all of our guests in the comment threads. Please follow and engage all of them on their social media channels too. Let's get into it, Adam. Em, I want to start with you. You have both sort of a sharp local view of events and a national view of how the work of M4BL is reaping rewards in this moment. Can you tell us about the threats from the right and from the Trump administration facing the communities that you organize? And tell us also about the dangerous voter repression efforts that are targeting the same folks that you're working with.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, and I'm really excited to be on this panel with the other incredible panelists. But the attacks from the right are vast and deep. To name just a few, and I'm sure we'll dig into more in a little bit here, but one of the things that we're seeing is a rise of vigilante violence. So both in the ground locally in Madison and also throughout the country, as reported by other members of the member organizations of the Movement for Black Lives, we're seeing an increase in violence against protesters. So just in Madison, Wisconsin alone, there have been 6 incidents that I know about where cars have run into protesters and have injured Black women. We also have an incident of a Black woman just driving at night and lighter fluid being thrown on her and she being burned by white nationalists. And so the increase in everyday violence from white vigilantes is on the rise. In addition to that, we also see intense repression backed by the Trump administration, where we see not only egregious charges against protesters, so we have people who are protesting that are being overcharged with felonies and a whole host of other things and being locked up. We also have seen reports like in Portland where more covert, if you will, police militarized operations are happening where they are literally snatching protesters, literally snatching Black, brown, and Indigenous people off of the streets. In addition to that, we also see a host of policies, a host of cuts and threats to our communities by increasingly this administration taking resources from our communities that we desperately need. And so the attacks from the right are vast, they're big, they're deep, they're a major threat, but we are organized and resisting against it.
Thanks. And what would you say specifically? I'm just following up on that kind of leading into the election. How do you see these kind of repressive measures also playing out, like in voter suppression or voter repression?
They're happening in all kinds of ways. One of the ways that we've seen took place actually a few months ago in Wisconsin, where in the midst of a COVID-19 pandemic, our folks were forced to still go to the polls and vote. We see in Milwaukee alone where dozens of polling places were closed, causing overcrowding at polling places in the midst of a pandemic, and also, frankly, discouraging and disenfranchising a large Black voting bloc. In addition to that, we're also seeing threats, right? People are threatening people. People are attacking people. When I say people, white nationalists, white supremacists, right-wingers are attacking people, mainly Black, brown, and Indigenous people who are seeking to exercise their electoral, their political rights and exercising that through electoral processes. We've seen and have heard locally of protesters who've been threatened, where people are saying they're gonna. There have also been reports where people are threatening violence at the polling places, and so we already see organized resistance against people being able to go to the polls. And another concern that people have is, are mail-in voting options going to be just? We saw in Wisconsin where our folks were told that we would have more opportunities and abilities to vote in a safer way by not being crowded in polling places. But we found out that many of those votes were not going to be counted. And I think as Black folks, we know that all too well. And I think a lot about John Lewis, both because we unfortunately lost him, and he was just such an incredible person to Black liberation. And I think, frankly, all liberations struggles for people here in the United States and around the world. But, we know too well about voter disenfranchisement as Black folks. And so it's very timely that we are organizing in this moment of Freedom Summer to counter those attacks.
Thanks. And Daroneshia, same question to you. I mean, we've seen ongoing violence against trans folks. You lead an organization that's involved in the electoral work in the trans community. Just this week, I think Trump doubled down on his attacks on transgender homeless people or houseless people by issuing guidelines on identifying trans people seeking access to shelter, right? Trying to actually kick people directly out of shelters. So, I mean, tell us the attacks that you all are facing, working on, and kind of how that also relates to the election in your mind.
The attacks that we're working on, the attacks are happening every day, especially with this administration. It's just like you wake up, it's something on the news about what the administration wants to either draw back or remove policies from what they feel that our previous president Obama had basically put in place to protect transgender individuals, but just to not even much see us as human beings. We just had the win at the Supreme Court that protects us up under Equal Opportunity Act against employment discrimination, but to also say, like you said, to just issue this press conference from actually him and Ben Carson, just talking about how do you actually spot a transgender individual that's entering in the shelter, which is unfair because most of the shelters are receiving HUD funding. So we have to keep pushing the agenda to get our community engaged in practicing their political rights and knowing their own rights, knowing why it's important to show up at the polls. And actually, we talk about who is the best candidate and who's not the good candidate and who we're for, but just to realize who actually the candidate that will be better for us as marginalized individuals. And the trans community have experienced so much backlash from many of the administrations. So I think that it's critical that we're teaching our people to know their own rights, making sure when it comes to voter suppression, what that looks like in community, making sure that we have the accessibility to actually get to the polls, actually have those actual IDs that will match with how the person identified, because come to find out, there are many people that say they're going to the poll that, you know, if their presenting gender is not matched on their ID, it's possible that they can't vote because they are looking at everything so detailed on the roster. And I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and they was like, oh, we didn't know that you actually have to check in at a roster, and they look at it. I said, yes, it's serious, you know, that you give your ID and they go down the roster and they look and, you know, just making sure the information matches what's on the ID or whatever. And then especially, you know, with us living in this global pandemic right now, that we don't know what's tomorrow is going to look like, but actually just getting used to the new norm. How do we encourage our people to get out to vote, but they're scared because, you know, we have a lot of community members that's living with compromised immune systems and all this. So how do we say do early votes, you know, absentee voting? What does that actually look like with getting your ballot in and making sure your voice is heard and you're counted? But then you also get scared on another end, you know, like if you actually have to mail in, would you really be counted? Because we have seen so much have happened in the past. So is it really worth our time? So we're finding ourselves having a lot of those conversations, just saying like, let's just keep the faith, keep hope alive, and let's still, you know, send the ballot in and let's vote. You know, hopefully they'll do what's right.
Yeah, thanks, Daroneshia. Those are actually really concrete and stark examples. Appreciate you sharing those. And, you know, Judith, similar question to you. You know, Native organizers have scored some big victories recently, of course, but you know, the Trump administration's denial of COVID relief to Native communities is just one example of sort of the long historical attack on Indigenous communities in the U.S. Can you tell us about what these attacks look like in the age of Trump, and you know, the sort of age of the empowered far right, and what dangers of disenfranchisement as well Native communities are facing this November? I think you're muted, Judith.
I have to say that it has been a good 10 days to be Indigenous for a change.
That's right.
And without what Black Lives Matter and the Fight for 15 and the Dreamers and Occupy Wall Street has done over many years of compelling and morally calling on people to go into the streets when something like a horrendous murder, like the murder of George Floyd, it was the drop in the bucket that allowed for a 30-year struggle to get rid of the racist DC NFL team name happened. So we are all related. We are all in relationship, all the social movements. And I think the thing that has really hit me in a different and new way during this time of pandemic, and then the magic movement moment that we're in, is that never have I experienced how clear it is, how tightly woven pain and joy can be. And that we're in a moment in Indian country where, yes, we've had a number of really important steps forward, especially in the narrative arena. But the truth is that the violence that we face is systemic. It's long-term systemic racism and right-wing violence. So, for example, in Minneapolis, that's the place where the American Indian movement was founded in 1968. The reason why it was founded? Police violence, police killings of Indian people. And the truth is that at this point, based on a study that was released last year, Indian women are twice as likely to be stopped while walking or driving and twice as likely to be arrested in the city of Minneapolis more than any other race. And so the police department in Minneapolis, like many cities where we have large populations there, they have been using militarized policing, and we saw such an incredible display of it at Standing Rock. The truth is, though, that in a moment of pandemic, we face a special attacks because we're the only peoples that have collectively owned land that has been self-governed since the beginning of time. And so tribes, for example, in South Dakota, the governor, right-wing Trumper, Governor Noem, has been attacking the tribes who have decided to flex our moral inherent right to govern our own land and to create roadblocks and tracking systems so as to protect tribal communities from the spread of the coronavirus. Attacked, threatened legal action, arrests, for what? Because we were protecting our communities from the spread of the coronavirus, which she refused to do, which the Trump administration refuses to do. So when you look at the elections, I so agree that the whole debate around mail-in voting, will it be just? That is a big question in Indian country. We have had to fight for equal access and the right to vote in the last two cycles of the elections without mail-in voting. We had to, for example, take a lawsuit in Nevada in the midterm elections in order to guarantee that there were voting sites, satellite voting sites on Indian reservations where people would have to drive 2 hours one way just to vote. We won it. We didn't have equal access in the sense of the number of days of early voting or the number of hours. Same thing in South Dakota during the midterm election, same thing. They tried to strip us of the right to vote by passing a law that said we had to have an ID with a street address. There are no street addresses on a reservation. You go down by the fence, you take a left, you go 10 miles south. That's the street address. But we beat that back, and we organized on behalf of tribes in North Dakota in order to guarantee our right to vote. I think the biggest question that we'll face is protecting the right to have mail-in ballots when, in fact, Indian country, most people don't get their mail at home. Of course, urban Indians like myself, I'm an urban Indian. I walk with a high heel on one foot and a moccasin on the other. But for those who live on Indian reservations, most people, they go to the post office. And in order to get the ballot, they have to go to the post office. They have to take it home. They have to fill it out. They have to get a stamp, and then they have to go back to the post office, which is not just around the corner. So we have to work together to ensure that if we do protect our communities from the COVID-19 pandemic and go fully into mail-in voting, then we have to make sure the mail-in voting is just.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. And, Emma, I want to come back to you. I mean, like Judith was saying, all these movements are related and all these struggles are related. And a lot of people are saying, we need this kind of multiracial front to defeat Trump, right? To kind of come from all angles. At the same time, there's a concern that how do our communities actually take leadership in this front, and not be kind of dismissed, or the specific concerns or fights dismissed as the main candidate against Trump. Biden is not necessarily a hero for all of our causes. So how are the communities you're working with kind of taking leadership in the efforts? What do you think? How do you think they can kind of take leadership and also work alongside a broader front?
If it's okay, I actually want to pass it to Daroneshia. I see she was getting live when you was asking that question. So what you got for us, sis?
Yeah, go for it. Anyone can answer.
Well, I think I would have to say that when it comes to being the best fit, we know that no one would be the best fit, because everybody basically will try to sell a narrative like they for us. And we know like these people have this past, and it's systemic racism that have been going on for years. And I know that we talk about all the different leaders that we have had that have been in power, like they're not really showing up for us. But we got to think about who would be the better candidate in this situation. So that's my main focus, is talking about who would be the better candidate. I'm not telling you who to pick, but who would be the better candidate, basically acknowledging who you are. And when it comes to voting, I think people don't think about the intersecting pieces that's there. It's just not I'm a Black woman, but I'm a Black trans woman. So I need to make sure that I'm voting in the right way to not only stand for Black folks, but stand for Black trans folks as well. So I think that we have to basically try to analyze that data when we're looking at the people that we're picking and we're choosing and we're voting for, just to make sure that these people will be not only for one part of us, but for all of us. And that's just for community as a whole. Like, I know that, I once, was living below poverty. So just because I'm out of poverty now doesn't mean that I'm not advocating for people that's living in poverty. So if that makes sense, just picking the better candidate instead of the best candidate.
What you're saying, Daroneshia, is so important. And I think, how we get there is really being sharp about the question that we're asking. If the question is, how do we, which can we beat Trump? If that was your only concern, then it's simple. You'd say, well, vote for somebody else. But if you're saying, how do you defeat Trumpism, which is the defeat of this candidate, but it's the defeat of all the things that he represents. So it is where we are saying we're done with white nationalism. We are saying we're done with white supremacy. We are saying we're done with imperialism, exploitive extractive practices to the environment, the raping, the murdering, the assaulting of women and girls. We are saying we're done with transphobia, homophobia, ableism, anti-immigrant, right? We're saying we're done this movement, right? We have a different posture inside of this movement. In particular, right now, the mantra you hear coming from our movements, right, is that we are in defense of Black lives. And so what I think we're saying here is that we are actually not trying to settle by saying it's good enough that he's gone. We're trying to say, how do we defeat the whole thing, right? The protest rally, the protest cry, the whole damn system, right? How do you defeat the whole damn thing? And so that's really the question here at stake. That said, we are scientific, right? We are mindful about the systems that are existing, that have particular types of power, and we therefore are trying to position our communities to be as strong as we can to combat these things. And so we are aligning ourselves with one another. It is absolutely true. It is absolutely right. We are aligning ourselves with anybody who's taking serious the work of Black, Brown, Indigenous liberation, anybody who takes serious the work of queer, trans, intersex, women and girls, feminisms, disabled liberation. Like we saying, if you really are serious about that, then you join the cause and join the struggle. And the other thing that I think is significant about this moment is that we ain't asking, right? We are not here to negotiate. We are not even here to convince. We are rather here to implement and to assert, and we're going to do this together because we created this movement. They didn't, we did. We created this moment. They didn't, we did, right? It has been our brave actions. It's been, as Sister Judith pointed out, it's been 30 years of struggle. It's been decades of this. There's been moments of that. And also it's been an influx of new energy right now who is saying no more. So I think for us, this is the time to be bold and to be visionary and to not just settle with the defeat of one, but rather to lean into that vision we've been dreaming about.
I so agree with you. And I think of a woman that I work with. I'm blessed to work with. Her name is Norma Wong. She's a native Hawaiian. She was the first native Hawaiian woman to be elected to the state legislature. And she says that we in this moment have to think as organizers about 60% of our time should be thinking about the throughways to the future, the throughways to transformational change, and 40% of our time organizing creatively to respond to the everyday crisis and needs and demands. And when I think about that, I realize that we've spent so many years on the defensive. We've been on the defensive, and the right wing has been building power since Goldwater ran for president. And there's been some times when there was a Democratic administration, but the fact is that the right wing at the grassroots level and their infrastructure was growing. So we're at a moment where this fact blows my mind every time I say it, that 10% of all adults in the United States have been in the streets protesting the murder of George Floyd. It is the most multiracial movement that there's ever been in our history. And I've been to a few rodeos, so I know of what I say. I'm an elder. And the truth is that we have to focus on the key elements. Number one, ecosystem. Moments are not movements. We're in a moment. And we as organizers, we have to think through how do we build out an ecosystem within our community that is strong enough to be in solidarity, shoulder to shoulder with other communities. Secondly, we have to really think about narrative, because in so many ways, when you interrupt it, as we have in these last few months, or for example, American Indians, we staged an action when Trump went to the Black Hills, the sacred Black Hills in South Dakota. We staged an action, a direct action, blocking the highway, 200 people, a little more than 200 people. But the next day, we were on every major news station. You never see Indians every day on TV, especially Indian women. I almost cried every time I was watching another report about what happened when Trump was in the Black Hills. We interrupted the narrative. But we have to spend a lot of time of filling that interruption with our vision, our wholeness, and the sacred responsibility of taking action. So the narrative fight, we've got to be really skilled up and put a lot of emphasis on. And lastly, we have to understand elections as the exclamation point of our daily struggle for liberation, for freedom, for justice. It's one day. What happens leading up to it? What we're doing now is trying to build a base of support for moving our fight into the ballot box. But on the day after, our movement will be bigger, stronger, broader, if we plan for it. So voting is in many ways is very directly linked to us leveraging our power, no matter who gets elected on any level of government. In 7 states, the American Indian vote is one of the swing votes, 7 battleground states. Swing vote, where 77 electoral votes will be determined. There's in states where there's large Black populations, Mexican, immigrant. We have a power, if we can move the ecosystem to actually save democracy, and have a movement that sees that there's power in being able to have defeated Trumpism and Trump and all the right-wing, far-right candidates in landslides. Because that mandate will mean no matter who's elected, they will have to listen, continue listening, I should say, to what's happening in the streets, what's being said in the streets. And so the 2020 elections, it's an I'll quote Homer Simpson. It's a crisis-opportunity. It's a moment of is an opportunity for us to build our base of people who are ready to stand in the streets, stay in the streets, go to the ballot box, educate their neighbors, and just continue this beautiful moment and build it into a multiracial movement that can, for once and for all, end systemic racism and protect democracy.
That was amazing, Judith. And I don't think anybody's quoted Homer Simpson yet, but I usually we turn to Gramsci for crisis, but I think this might have been better. I don't know. We might roll with this one. I want to give you a quick second, Judith, to stretch your legs and answer another question, because there's sort of a easy pivot from the question you just answered. You know, inside of elections and when movements are sort of in major growth phases, growth stages, a question comes up of how do you not just relate to sort of your core base of sort of most impacted folks, but how do you relate to a broader set of social forces? You know, I think M, stated really clearly before, right? Like we're trying to, you'll take whoever you can get. But from the perspective of strategy, if you're like, especially around elections where there's like a targeting that needs to happen about sort of where you put your energy, there's a question of sort of how you relate to what we can broadly sort of call middle forces, right? So because the Democrats kind of instinctively ignore working class Black and brown people when they're doing their targeting and focus on white suburban voters, white moderate voters, movements, I think correctly sort of instinctively reject this move and focus on turning out our sort of core base. It's an important strategic pivot, but sort of when we examine the national landscape, we have to figure out which are the forces outside of our core base that we need to relate to, include, organize alongside. So inside of this sort of like expansive view that you're giving us of, who it is that we need to bring in the forces that will be with us, that will be bigger, after the day after the election, the 10% of people who are in the streets, all of that. Can you help us think about like which are the groups of people that organizers that are sort of on the ground grinding out every day? Who are the groups that both organized and unorganized that we need to bring into our camp that we may not yet be paying enough attention to?
I think there are no new ideas ever. We're just building on what our ancestors have done and taking the best forward. From an Indigenous framework, the past meets the present. And in the present, we're thinking about our ancestors. So the future meets the past in the present. How we organize, how we walk, how we build a sense of community, how it is that how we do things is as important as what we do. And frankly, for the left, starting with the left, we have to lead with our values. We have to lead with a sense of the sacred trust that we hold because we are walking in the present for the protection of our descendants and because of our ancestors. And in some ways, when we're talking about organizing models, it's as old as dirt. Indians have been organizing since dirt, right? It's about circles. It's about building circles and seeing that relational organizing as one that brings with it a power that is invincible. So from our experience, what we're attempting to do is for groups on the ground to bring their core together, and for those people to have 10, 12 people that they're bringing around them, and so on and so on. It's not rocket science. It's as old as dirt. But I think that as we build in circles, then those who have already have the connections cross community and statewide and nationally, we will come together because we're going to have to protect the vote. I think we need to pick out those precincts in all of the working class, Black, Latino, American Indian, Asian Pacific Islanders, Arab Muslim communities. We need to pick those precincts where we're going to join together for the bottom line, protecting democracy, because we know it's under threat right now. Secondly, I think that there are many candidates now that are running. We have 8 candidates, American Indian candidates, running for office. It's huge. The first 2 American Indian women ever in history, because we've never had our Barbara Lee or our Maxine Waters, got elected in the midterms. So we have 8 candidates running. So none of Black candidates or Indian candidates or Latino candidates never run representing only their people. The gerrymandering that has gone on for years. The fact is that people of color who go to Congress represent very multiracial areas. And where they don't, where it's more concentrated, that's where you see some of the attacks. So I think there's a basis when you look at local candidacies for us to build out our ecosystems. But in the main, we've been preparing for this for a long time. The 2020 elections is really about building on the movement relationships that we have building for the last, for a long time for some of us, for the last 4 years under Trump, where there's a growing recognition of the threat to democracy that he and the far right are presenting. So it's not rocket science.
Gotcha. I just want to open up to others if you agree or have thoughts. I mean, I've used a similar analogy before of kind of the election is that, where you kind of collect your power after everything, or like you just said, exclamation point. But, I think also this year we're, particularly concerned, like, let's make sure it's not a question mark. Let's make sure it's that exclamation point in November. So how are you all feeling about, kind of the alliances you're building? Who are you working with to kind of make sure those precincts are covered, or, that those states that went just by, thousands or tens of thousands of votes last time don't do it again? Anyone else want to add to that before we go on?
Yeah, I'll just say a few things about that. I think that, one, the role of electoral organizing is sometimes a contentious one, and not because we don't see a value in building the exclamation mark, as Judith pointed out. I'm like, ooh, that's good. I wrote that down. In fact, we do have a value in it. I mean, I think there's so much incredible organizing efforts happening right now that's around people helping people get the documentation needed in order to vote, people engaging voters and potential voters on the issues that they care about and letting them know, what a vote this way or that way means in terms of, themselves, their families, and the issues that they care about. And so I think, we're doing a lot of work around building a broad-based coalition that can be united, and not just united against one particular person, but really we want people united toward a vision, right? We want people to stay with us past a particular day in November. And because what we know historically, and also just as a matter of observation, is if we don't stay together, the sad truth is that many of our lives may not be different, even if we get a particular outcome in November. So we have to be committed to one another beyond one particular day, because the work of undoing the empire, the work of upending, dismantling colonialism, cis heteropatriarchy, racial capitalism, et cetera, is going to go way beyond, or has to happen way beyond just the state in November. But the other thing that I wanted to point to in terms of who we're paying attention to, I think it's who, and I also think it's how. I think it's our responsibility on the left to ensure that there are democratic processes for all of our folks. And so I think one of the things that's really exciting about this moment and is revealing is that protest in some form or another is democracy for the disinherited, right? It is a way for people to register their outrage, for people to register, what these set of issues or what these set of action means against their life and also their community's life. So I think we on the left, we have to think strategically about how we ensure particular outcomes in the electoral arena. Absolutely. But alongside of that, or in tandem with that, we have to be thinking about all of our folks who are disenfranchised, who are locked out of that system and process, and making sure that they can weigh in terms of building this vision and this future that we want. So I think about people who are undocumented. Freedom Inc., we work with Black and Southeast Asian people. There are people, Hmong people, Cambodian people who are not documented and therefore aren't able to vote or participate in the electoral processes. I think about the Black community or descendants of Africans enslaved here in the U.S. I think about how many family members I have that are felons and or who are on some form of paper and not able to exercise or to engage in the electoral processes in terms of voting. I think about African immigrants, Latinx immigrants, refugees, and other undocumented folks who are lapped outside of those practices. Again, lifting up what Daroneshia said, that's really important. I think about other gender non-conforming people like myself, transgender people, intersex people, and a host of other people who don't have the documentation that reflects who they are. And so I think, and there's the amount of people who are incarcerated. I mean, there are just so many of our people, right? Not a person in the abstract, but so many of our people. And hell, all the people under fucking 18. Look, I'm cussing on your news channel. Sorry, but you get the real me after a certain hour. Just kidding. But there's so many people, and I even think about young people. What are the democratic processes that we are building inside of our movements to register, to take count, to demonstrate their voices? So I think that this is an opportunity for our movements to both do this incredible work of organizing inside of the electoral arena, fundamentally challenging the unjust system of the electoral arena, from electoral college to this entire model of having some random dude be able to dictate your life, in such big ways. But it's also a way for us to fully bring our folks in and not as periphery to this process.
Thanks. That's really important. And thanks for mentioning. And I don't think we should even suggest that the protests don't in themselves change the electoral arena, right? I mean, what obviously has happened this year is people engaging in in democracy, as you say, through protest, and that is even changing the outcomes, or what we think are the outcomes already. Daroneshia, for you, how are you all approaching the kind of building the electoral coalitions, and how would you respond to what Judith and Em are saying?
Well, I have to say my whole main focus around building political power within the organization that I'm in charge of and running it's very critical to me, due to the fact that every time it comes time to vote, the only election from a child up that even mattered was the presidential election. And I think that's unfair for us to look at this. The presidential election is the only one that matters. So around programming within Trans United and the work at Trans United Fund is to basically make voter engagement more practical. And when I say practical, it's greater than 365. So, and then it's also greater than just the presidential election. Let's start local, state level, and federal level, because we're going to have to make implementations on each level to get what we need for our communities and the people that we're fighting for in the cause. And also, we have the Building Power cohort that's up under Trans United, and there are physical sponsored organizations, that's 9 of them or whatever. So giving them the power to design out what kind of civic engagement programming they want to do, and how do they want to get their community involved, where it's immigrants, Latino, gender non-conforming, trans women, trans men, Black and brown. What does that look like? How are you getting the community involved? Just letting them be creative and just getting people out to vote. So when November do come, that if we got Uber codes that we're sharing, Lyft codes that we're sharing, we're getting people to the poll. If we're doing mail-in, we want to make sure that if people need stamps and envelopes, that's on hand, that we're preparing ourselves for what the new norm look like, living and dealing with the pandemic.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Yeah, I would love to hear more about that cohort at some point, Daroneshia. I think that's really interesting. I want to quick just say that I think we had a few hundred people from Bernie Sanders join us sort of halfway through the show. So welcome. We have this powerhouse crew talking about how to fight back against the most stringent attacks on our communities in this moment. And Em, I want to come back to you because there's a perennial debate every time people get into any kind of conversation about electoral strategy. A place where the conversation falls apart is inevitably sort of the question of how to think about the Democratic Party, right? And inevitably part of that, the problem with that debate is that we haven't had, partly the sort of dominance of the two-party system has made it hard for an alternative to emerge, and we haven't fully developed a strategy of how to navigate that in a way that gives us the kind of organization that we need yet. Things are changing, but it still in some ways, shapes the kind of strategies that are available to us year to year. But can you tell us, in your view, what is the sort of organization that we need, the kind of independent organization that we need to really, sort of express our real fight and our real power and strength? What are the steps do you think that we can take to build that while we're sort of in this fight to defeat Trump and Trumpism, as you suggest?
Yeah, that's thanks for that question. I think we need a strategy that does two things. I think we need to both be thinking about building up this dual and competing power. So thinking about our own independent political parties, thinking about our own structures, right, as part of the power building to get us to where we want to be ultimately in our vision. In addition to that, at the same time is that I think we also need to be thinking about harm mitigation strategies as well. I think the COVID-19 pandemic was quite revealing. I think, we can see, let me say this a different way. We cannot allow the state to be off the hook. And so while we're building our own independent political parties, while we're building our own autonomous structures and preparing to move into power and whatever that means across a number of sectors, I think we also have to be holding people with particular amounts of power, types of power accountable to our communities. And at the very least be forcing them, right? And this is what it is a forcing. People aren't just doing it because they all of a sudden woke up today and decided to be good to our people, but we have to force them to do right by us. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic shows us the intense harm that happens to our communities when these systems don't do right by us. And I also think at the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic reveals how we both need to be building our own, as well as forcing this existing system and apparatus to treat our folks well, because it did matter if a new hospital was built. It did matter if the government did administer particular resources to communities, or it mattered if they didn't. And so I'm saying that to say, I think what we need to be thinking about is absolutely building our own, because we see the failures of the Democratic Party. We've seen the failures of countless elected officials across parties in several different offices and tiers of government. And we also have to be thinking about harm mitigation currently while we're doing that work, because our folks are dying. And so we do need to be forcing people, forcing these offices, forcing these people inside, these electeds, to do right by our folks. So I think we need to build a strategy that does both.
That's excellent. Judith, I'd love to get your view on this question too. Do you want to jump in?
Sure. The reality is that the Rona has been the biggest interruption of the economy, of politics, and of cultural continuity that we've ever experienced. None of us, I'm 68, none of us have ever experienced this kind of an interruption. And so we have a moment when we can understand what power is from in somewhat of a time when there's contention of power in the streets, but also in the suites. Look, the DC NFL team name, 30 years of organizing. There were ups and downs. Sometimes, in the 90s, we won some colleges or high schools changing their names. But ultimately, after 30 years, FedEx, Walmart, Target, Amazon, they felt the power shifting. They felt the questioning. Like 59% of people polled by the Wall Street Journal, NBC News in the past week recognized the problem of systemic racism, that it is a problem. So these big corporations pulled the DC team, swag off their sites, out of their stores, and that was huge. And we had targeted boycotts, FedEx, all kinds of economic pressure. But at this moment, there's a lot of shifting. And so I think we have to look at the idea of working within or outside of the Democratic Party in a nonlinear way. Under capitalism, you tend to look at things from a Western point of view. That's what's indoctrinated in us. There's right, there's wrong, there's no gray, there's good, there's bad. Well, truth is, for the left, we can't afford that luxury. Our people are dying and they're suffering from system failure. So therefore, we have to build the power that exists within the Democratic Party, with OAC, with Maxine Waters, John Lewis, the power that they were leveraging, and outside of the Democratic Party, which that power is being built. I mean, we don't have to debate whether or not we need independent forums. We have so many independent forums that are flowering right now because we're taking it into the streets. We're compelling city councils to take action around policing. We're on the move. We're on the move. So I think the most important thing is to understand that the power that we leverage within the Democratic Party, from progressive movements within the Democratic Party, and the power we're building outside of the Democratic Party, is what's going to bring about alternative parties. And support for, like, the Working Families Party is a good example of building within and outside of. I want to say lastly that at this moment in history, the biggest thing the left has to do is to change how and the way we do political education. I thank God for Organizing Upgrade. I think it's an amazing space for debate and discussion. But we have to recognize we're off the margins right now. The mainstream is debating issues that we've held true to, we've stood for, we've fought for, that healthcare is a human right, so is education, that on and on and on. There's so many issues. So I think we need to think about popular ways, mass public education, doing things that go beyond like this Organizing Upgrade Facebook Live event. We have to do that. We have to help people understand how power is moving, with what power we actually hold because of our values, our spirituality, and how that enables us to bring our communities together and challenge the power of the 1%, but also create emerging power. Emerging power. We are doing things in our communities that show that there is a different way of operating. So, meeting economic needs, meeting our physical needs, meeting our spiritual needs. So we're in this magic movement moment, and frankly, unless we really upgrade the kind of organizing and political education that Organizing Upgrade does, but so many of us who work in communities must do every day in ways small and big, so that we can lead in an effective way.
Thank you. Thank you also for the commercial for the show, which the next one's on August 12th. So we'll go from several hundred to several million viewers, hopefully. we could end there, but I do want to, on a serious note, kind of ask a last question to Daroneshia or anyone, because we are winning in some ways, right? As you described, both changing the narrative and also winning concrete things. And you can also see the reaction growing, right? Like the violence against protesters, the violence against a lot of communities, and the kind of desperation of the administration by sending troops to cities, et cetera. Like, how do you think that we can respond? There, obviously one way would be, okay, let's get out of the streets because this is getting too hectic. Or it's like, no, let's flood the streets. We need to get rid of, need to kind of flood this risk. What should an approach be? What approach are you taking to the kind of increasing violent reaction to our forces growing and winning? You want to take a stab at that, Daroneshia?
Yeah, I guess that we'll have to say the forces that we are taking is basically just political education. That political education is the key. Like, I understand what protesting look like. We taking it to the streets. Of course, that a lot of movements have begun with the rioting and what that looks like for community. But once we educate our people the importance of voting, then we can really make a difference. I was thinking about something when the two was answering the questions, what does it actually look like? But building a base in our younger years, like in youth, through school, implemented as a part of education curriculum course, and what that looks like to make sure that our kids understand the importance of voting. Once you go off to college, still be engaged on voters engagement and what that looks like for our community, because the only way that we can win is that we have to continue to fight. And that can be physical, that can be with the pen, that can be at the poll, like whatever that looks like for our community. But we have to keep pushing the agenda of the importance. Hey, get involved with voting, voters engagement, civic engagement, just having that conversation. And I think, like I said, it'll be more practical because most of the time we are never engaged in voting until it's time, to vote at the presidential, election or whatever. So I think that if we start now, which I really think that a lot of us should have started back almost 4 years ago, and we would have been ready to defeat Trump. But of course, we're not giving up. There is hope. Anything can happen. So I'm just staying very positive about the situation and just keep doing what I know how to do best and organizing on the grounds and letting my people know the importance of voting, and those that have limited accessibility to the things that they need to vote, making sure that those things are happening.
Got you. Thanks for that. We're going to wind down. This conversation's always feels like we could go on. We're going to do an hour. We'll do an hour again in just under a month. But yes, really want to thank our guests today for spending the time with us. Viewers get to know them, get to know their organizations, and I'll kick it to you, Rishi, to finish us off for the night.
Yeah, thanks again, everyone. Really amazing. All three of you were just brilliant and really insightful, so thank you. 3 weeks, August 12th is our next show. It'll sort of kick off the sprint, from August to November, so it's going to be a really important show. We encourage folks to show up. Thanks to the Real News team. I want to echo what Judith put out at the end. We need places for not only political education, but for deepening strategy. Organizing Upgrade is one key place. So if you agree with Judith that we need to be building up Organizing Upgrade as a site with broader and broader reach, please donate as much as you can. We ask folks to make a minimum of $5 donation. Recurring donations are great. And that link will be in the chat wherever you're watching. So thanks so much again. Please stay safe out there. Stay fierce. Let's keep the pressure up. Let's keep organizing. Stay strong. Stay powerful. Thanks, everyone.